All right, this is an author at work. I'm going to be reading from my book. It Takes Many Lifetimes from Nazi to Empath, and this is going to be chapter 2. So, chapter 2, Scary Santa and Grimm Fairytales. Childhood in Germany had its thrills. One fine day, unexpectedly, Father visited us. A rare event. He brought a boxed set of tiny plastic plates, cups, and a teapot for Laurie and me. The set looked like Delft miniatures, replete with a lovely trim of painted blue flowers. We'd never received such a spectacular present before and bubbled over with excitement. Eager to make use of the fine gift, Laurie and I gathered up our dolls, a scruffy teddy bear, and a bunny with a missing leg. We positioned the group on the sofa by our table for a tea party. Father and Mother had talked, and Father had left again. Oma had gone shopping. Mother was preoccupied and sitting in the other room knitting, paying no particular attention to us. Laurie was 5 to my 3. "I'm making us hot water for the tea," Laurie said. "Yes," I chirped, pleased by the idea. While Laurie made the tea preparations, I hurried to put the little cups and saucers in place on our table. Tea with our very own beautiful tea set. Laurie scooped a spoon of tea into the lovely teapot and ladled a bit of water into it. She dragged a chair over to the stove, climbed up, and set the teapot atop the stove's hot plate. Almost at once, we heard a sizzling sound. White smoke, together with a horrid and ghastly stench, rose from the stove and filled the air. In seconds, the stove melted our precious teapot. It was no more. The tea leaves burned into the melted ooze, and the water released from the pot hissed and turned to steam. Our delight turned to horror. We looked from the stove to each other, rendered speechless by the catastrophe. It had been the nicest gift we'd ever received, and now the teapot was a stinky, gooey puddle. We'd been standing there staring in in petrified silence as Oma entered the apartment. "Krista wanted a tea party. It's all her fault," Laurie immediately burst out. I was already in tears. Words failed me. I'd truly been an eager participant. Oma erupted immediately, directing her full wrath at my sister. "You wretch! You good for nothing, always and ever causing disasters the moment my back is turned. An ill wind brought you to us. You'll be the death of me yet. You must be the devil's own seed, you nasty creature." Oma set down the groceries she'd brought and snatched up a wooden spoon. She caught Laurie and swung into action, placing several resounding whacks on Laurie's behind. Laurie was used to being hit by Oma. In the early years, Oma hitting Laurie was an almost daily occurrence. Laurie tried to escape the blows by wriggling loose and ducking under the table. I should have jumped in with a good word for Laurie to soften Oma's anger. After all, at 5 and 3, how could either of us possibly have known you can't put plastic on a hot stove? But Laurie had tried to pin the entire disaster on me when she was the one that came up with the idea to heat the water. I wasn't going to help her. She was on her own. At times, Laurie laughed as she was being hit. Laurie's laughter would rile up Oma even more and cause her to wallop Laurie even harder. I was usually the one crying as the beatings took place, though no one ever hit me. The beatings were intended to make Laurie more obedient. They had the opposite effect. Laurie grew more rebellious with time. Once the stove had been allowed to cool, it took Oma some time and elbow grease to scrape the plastic ooze off the burner. She grumbled and fumed as she worked away. A remnant of burnt plastic odor lingered for days, reminding us of our loss. Once the stove had been allowed to cool, it took Oma some time and elbow grease to scrape the plastic ooze off the burner. She grumbled and fumed as she worked away. Stupid, crazy imbecile. Oma meant Laurie, of course. I was evidently deemed too young to know better. Mother received a tongue lashing as well. And where in the world were you, my sleeping brainless beauty, when Hannelore put this thing on the stove? Oma glared at Mother. I was concentrating on my knitting and just didn't notice until that awful smell started, Mother excused herself. You have absolutely no sense whatsoever. Zero, not a single ounce. It's a sheer wonder you even made it to adulthood, Uma yelled at her. She could easily have caused a fire and burned this place down, Uma raged, pointing at Lori. Then where would we be now? The least you could do around here is keep a decent eye on your kids when I go shopping for us. After all that excitement about the melted teapot, we were told that the beautiful plastic tea set was a parting gift from my father, whom I'd seen only 3 or 4 times since he'd collected me from the hospital. Let me readjust the focus here. It turned out that he was moving to Canada. After that visit, he vanished entirely from our lives for the next 6 years. Oma lived in constant fear we'd be tossed out into the street. She worried that the Kramers living directly below us would complain about the noise Lori made as she ran about and jumped, laughed, or yelled. With Lori's slightest stirring, Oma anxiously anticipated being evicted. And Lori, who was fiercely healthy, full of vitality, and inherently incapable of being still, stirred a lot. As penniless refugees, Mother and Oma had no clout as far as housing in Zulingen or elsewhere. Then also Lori, not being in the least mindful, failed to appreciate Oma's fear and rising anger as she repeatedly asked Lori to sit still and keep quiet. Until Oma exploded, that is. Hence Lori got many beatings. But I was the one crying. It hurt me to see Oma so beside herself, and Lori being hit. It also made me feel powerless, as I was unable to change Lori's behavior, nor was I able to moderate Oma's wrath towards Lori. Mother took Oma's rages in stride. She never talked back. It would have been pointless. Oma ruled the roost, and we all knew it. Not prone to making friends or being easily able to engage socially, my mother was supremely gifted with knitting needles. She knitted the blue dress I'm wearing on the book's cover photo. But the wool stockings she made for us and their scratchiness going all the way up our thighs was an endless torment in the winter. Worse, we had to wear stocking garters to hold the darn things up, which made wearing them even more repulsive. Of all the days in a year, Christmas Eve was the highlight for Lori and me. We were both giddy with anticipation for the day to arrive. For a month, we eagerly took turns each day opening a tiny paper door on our advent calendar, counting down the days until Christmas Eve. Oma would set a 1 to 2 foot tall baby spruce tree atop our dresser. The tree was adorned with a few simple ornaments, a star on top, tinsel, and several real candles. The tree went up Christmas Eve day and was taken down before New Year's Eve. Though tiny, the tree's annual arrival marked the great event. What would this Christmas bring? We vibrated with anticipation. Lori and I would be thrilled to get a platter with a bit of chocolate, maybe some marzipan, gingerbread, an orange or apple, and half a dozen hazelnuts, walnuts, or Brazil nuts. Such a treat. On good years, we might receive a gift as well. Sometimes it was as simple as a small pot of honey for me and a sausage ring for Lori, who didn't have my sweet tooth. If it wasn't something edible, the gift, however small, would be treasured by us for years. After the candles were lit, but before we were able to open our gift, the rare time there was one, or enjoy even a nibble of the goodies on the plates, we all sang. Stille Nacht, Silent Night, O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree, Alle Jahre wieder, returning each year, and several other Christmas favorites were standard. Oma, Mother, Lori, and me all singing. We sounded pretty good. While the candlelight flickered and the tree's pine fragrance sweetly filled the air, Lori's and my excitement kept growing. Everything important pertaining to the sacred holiday took place on Christmas Eve in Germany. Normally, after we had unwrapped our gift and eaten a couple of treats from our platter, we'd get bundled up and all troop off to church for the Christmas sermon. It was the only day of the year Mother attended with us. One Christmas Eve, when Lori was 7 and I was 5, our singing was interrupted by the sound of someone coming up the attic steps. A man. We stopped and listened. The man's awful speech was garbled. Ha! Damn it all! Ho, ho, ho! Hey! Oof! Ouch! Shit! Ha! Ha! he bellowed. Could this have been Santa, we wondered? He seemed to be falling repeatedly as he came clattering up the steps to the attic, making terrific noise as he neared. Curious but frightened by the approaching racket, Lori and I ducked behind Mother's wide skirt. Shortly there was a pounding on our door. Oma opened the door and cautiously looked out. "Merry Christmas, ladies!" Santa slurred as he moved Oma aside with a large gloved hand. Santa was an arresting sight. His hat was askew. His flowing curly white beard was smudged with what looked like tobacco stains. His jacket had a button missing, and there was a tear in his right sleeve. His boots were badly scuffed, and his white gloves were soiled. We all stared at Santa, our mouths open. I expected Oma to immediately scold Santa. She'd be angry with us if we got our clothes dirty or torn. It was a big deal, part of her cleanliness being next to godliness mantra. We'd be ever so sorry and promised to take better care the next day. But Oma, like the rest of us, stood gaping open-mouthed at Santa, her forehead wrinkled. I'd never seen Oma at a loss for words before. Santa was good and drunk. The odor of alcohol had entered with him. He was barely able to stand on his legs as he continued to stagger into the room and slam the door behind him. He carried a sack over his shoulder. I stepped back further behind Mother. Santa set down his sack, turned to Oma and Mother, and bellowed, "Have these little girls been good children this year?" Oma quickly recovered herself. "No, not that one," she said, pointing at Lori. "She's been nothing but an absolute devil the whole year, never listens to me, talks back, lies, steals, won't ever sit still, and gets into one piece of trouble after another all the time. I hope you did not bring anything for her." Though terrified, I found myself mesmerized by Santa. He was swaying back and forth, towering over Oma. I wondered if Santa could crush Oma if he toppled over onto her. Maybe not. Oma was a powerhouse of an old woman. "Naughty chillum gets no Christmas presents, and no indeedy. But I have something else here for you," Santa laughed, then erupted into a volley of deep coughs as he opened the sack. With the coughs, his alcohol fumes spread even more around the room. He bent down, reached deep into the sack, and groped around. A second later, he brought out a whip made of sapling branches tied together with a rope, and the whole of it painted black, an ominous-looking device. He handed the whip to Oma as he produced a resounding belch. "Thank you, Santa. The perfect gift for her." Oma ignored the belch. "Now we'll see whether you listen to me or not," Oma yelled at Lori, waving the whip at her. Lori jumped back out of reach of the whip, tripping herself and doing an awkward backward somersault in the process. "Oh my God, priceless," Mother laughed, and doubled over with mirth. Lori burst into tears. "And now for you," Santa said, turning in my direction and looking at me with his red bloodshot eyes. I was anxious to the point of almost feeling nauseous about what this terrible Santa might have brought for me. Usually petrified with fear of the rages I'd seen Oma get into with Lori, I'd been almost perfect that year, except for repeatedly sliding down our delightful marble banister against Oma's wishes. I had just enough of a guilty conscience to feel a wave of dread rise up and grab hold of me, with scary Santa staring at me. Santa reached into his sack once more. He pulled out a doll for me. I adored dolls. The doll wasn't wrapped. Santa held the doll upside down by one of its legs. "Looky here, good little girl." Santa handed the doll to me and emitted another remarkably foul belch. The doll was the size of a newborn and was exquisitely beautiful. It had a porcelain head with ruby-red lips and a tiny opening, hair that was blonde just like mine, and blue eyes a bit darker blue than mine, with long lashes on eyelids that opened and closed like a real baby's. As I eagerly reached for the doll, a piece of the back of its head fell off. Inside the head, you could see a mechanism that allowed the eyelids to open and close. Apparently, Santa had crashed onto the sack as he stumbled on his way up our steps and broken the doll. "Oops, sorry about that, kid," Santa said. Hee. Shitty steps, not enough light." He chortled and emitted another huge belch. "I'm sure you can have it fixed. Well, Merry Christmas," he said once more. Santa closed his sack. As he slung it back over his shoulder, the sack brushed against the Christmas tree with its lit candles. We stood riveted to our place and watched. The tree tottered for a second, the branches and their candles quivering. It seemed we watched for an eternity, but it was truly a second or even a nanosecond. The imminent peril of setting the attic ablaze and being roasted alive stretched that second out. "Oh, dear Lord, not the tree!" Oma cried as she rushed to steady the tree. But the tree held its ground. The disaster was averted. "Well, shit, for fuck's sake," said Santa, his eyebrows raised. "Santa, please, your language," shrieked Oma. "Oops," said Santa. A second later, Santa was banging and clattering his way back down the steps, belching and cussing, damning all the women folk to hell as he went. Oma stood looking down the steps after him, aghast. The rest was behind her. "Well, I never—" Old Santa was beyond drunk, and on the holiest night of the year. Such an unutterable blasphemy. What a rascal. This won't do at all. I'll just have to report him to the rector. As Santa's footsteps receded, I looked at the doll, grief-stricken. It had a hole at the back. And then there was the chunk that had fallen off, together with the hair attached to the chunk. Lori was traumatized also, tears in her eyes, too upset to even enjoy the goodies on her platter. Our emotions were still churning, and we couldn't get into the proper spirit later that night during church services. It was a Christmas that Lori and I would long remember. The beautiful doll was taken to a man who repaired doll injuries. She came back with her head put back together, but I was warned to handle her with utmost care. I named her Erica, the name of one of my father's sisters, a devout Christian Scientist whom up to that time we had never met. My precious dolly Erica lived with me for almost a year, until the day I generously decided to share my raisins with her. Invited by the tiny opening in her precious mouth, I shared judiciously. One raisin for me, one for Erica, one for me, one for Erica. I fairly divided the raisins between us, stuffing one raisin at a time into Erica's little mouth. I must have pushed one of the raisins a bit too hard getting it in. Suddenly, Erica's entire head came off her body. The porcelain head crashed to the floor and broke into pieces. Raisins flew everywhere. Erica could not be fixed this time. I cried for days, inconsolable over her premature and unexpected demise, a death by raisins. Years later, I would hear that Santa was just one of the men from our church playing at being Santa that night. Thankfully, he was never allowed to be Santa again. With Oma's help, I learned to read by the age of 5. Reading thrilled me, especially in the winter months when we spent more time indoors. Summers were easier for us since we could go out into the nearby woods each week to pick wild berries and mushrooms. I ate my fill of the berries as we picked, making it harder to get our little basket full. In summer, the fields were full of wildflowers. I picked red poppies, daisies, and sky blue cornflowers, as many as my hands could hold. Running through the open fields with flowers in bloom, butterflies zipping about, and the big blue sky above was a happy part of my childhood. Still, I could hardly wait for my first day of school. German kids get a large, colorfully decorated cone filled with sugary treats on their first day of school. The goodies in the cone would feed my insatiable craving for sugar. The very smell of the leather satchel I'd be using to carry my books and pencils to school excited me. Handling the wooden pencil case with its sliding lid thrilled me. Before the first day of classes, I made sure my pencil points were sharp. I was ready. School, an easy 10-minute walk from home, was in an old worn building. The whole building was shabby but clean. Most of the pupils were well behaved and attentive. Our teacher allowed no noise or silliness in her class. She walked around with a wooden ruler in her hands and did not hesitate to whack disruptive students. By contrast, I hear that kids in German primary schools today throw papers and books at each other, laugh or talk during instructions, and run around the room without permission or punishment. It was a wholly different world back then. Teachers had free rein with corporal punishment and made the most of it. We learned addition and subtraction using packets of long wooden sticks. A packet held 20 sticks. It was easy to add and subtract when you could see that when you placed 2 sticks next to 2 more sticks, it added up to 4 sticks. If math was fun, learning to write was even better. Carefully and neatly I printed out entire rows of A's, B's, C's. Indeed, learning to write was every bit as magical as learning to read had been. All of it was thrilling and gave me joy. Oh, to write words and sentences! An entire universe was opening before my eager mind, and I happily seized it with both hands. On the other hand, my daily nemesis at school was a 10-sided wooden outhouse that stood behind the old school building. Known as the Heavenly Carousel due to its shape, the outhouse had 5 seats on each side, separated by gender. It was the most stinky and awful place I'd ever experienced up to that time, especially as the weather grew warmer. How all the students survived this primitive outhouse is beyond knowing. But I never heard of a kid falling into the hopper or dying of E. coli or hepatitis. We were a hardy bunch. An anomaly in my family, I was not at all comfortable having others hear me pee or poop. Hence my discomfort at mother's hearty loud farts. At night I shied from using the chamber pot with its lack of privacy. During the day I tried to avoid using the heavenly carousel at school, and I did not care for the splintery seat of the outhouse at home either, but it ended up being the least of the evils in my mind. I held everything in as long as humanly possible. As a result, even while my mind was leaping with the thrill of what I was learning, I was often constipated during my first year of school. Almost daily doses of cod liver oil delivered on large spoons, oh yucky, wretched memory, kept me functioning. At home I plowed through endless books of fairy tales. The most blood-curdling and harrowing stories were from the Brothers Grimm, an aptly named pair of brothers. In the stories, kids and adults could be decapitated or turned into swans or stones. The immense cruelty and the suspense would set my heart racing. But in the end, the good guys always won. I couldn't get enough of the stories. They carried me entire worlds away from the attic and my family. Decades later, the first book I'd write and publish, Popo, was a fairy tale featuring a magic kitten helping a child escape the dastardly plot of an evil stepmother. Clearly, the stories of childhood stayed deeply embedded in my subconscious and remained with me for life. The tension, stress, and at times cruelty in our attic apartment seemed less serious compared to decapitations and being turned into a stone or a swan. Just let me get my hands on you, you Nichtsnutz. Good for nothing. Oma yelled at Lori, wooden spoon in hand, ready to do its work. Lori had pilfered apples from the yard next door, a forbidden treat. Somebody reported her theft to Oma, and a beating was on its way. It was just another typical day in our apartment. I was 6 to Lori's 8 and buried in the book The Arabian Nights. I visualized the opulent caves of Ali Baba and his 40 thieves. I imagined splendid person-sized jars in many delicious colors stashed around the nooks and crannies of the cave, overflowing with coins, mountains of emeralds, diamonds, rubies, bracelets, and silver goblets. Imagine finding a cave filled with limitless treasure. I thrilled to the words "Open Sesame." Enthralled by the overflowing bounty in the cave, and breathlessly worried about whether the intruder was safely hidden, I could mostly tune out the mayhem in our apartment. Sometime in my 7th year, our family moved from the bank building. Oma was moved into her own apartment, one on the ground floor, sparing her aging knees. Mother, Lori, and I were moved to a 2-room apartment that was attached to or part of a farmhouse at the edge of town. We still had no running water and still had to use an outhouse. Our new apartments, as the old had been, were funded by welfare. I continued to sleep in my crib since there was no money to replace it with a bed. It was not a problem for me as I slept curled up in a ball. I missed Oma's protecting me from Lori. I did not miss Oma's raging and beating Lori. The summer we moved from the attic, the city built a new schoolhouse. It was bright and airy and had proper bathrooms with running water and flush toilets. With the start of 2nd grade and the use of the new school and its plumbing, my constipation abated. Thank God! Something like year-long constipation can set off lots of internal systems in the wrong direction. During those early years in Germany, no teacher, at least not up until 3rd grade, The last grade I attended in Zulingen ever mentioned Hitler or the recent World War. That part of Germany's history wasn't included in our curriculum. As children born after the war had ended, we remained blissfully unaware of that being Jewish, a gypsy, physically or mentally impaired, or gay could get you killed. As children in Germany, we had not been told about the millions who had died in death camps or the millions that had died in battle. Evidently, our parents and teachers felt it was too great and overwhelming a burden to impose on children. Life without Oma was less traumatic, quieter. Lori got better about not being caught in petty misdeeds and was really punished by Mother. After school, Lori helped some nearby farm families. These were small mom-and-pop sized farms, perhaps covering a 50-acre plot of land per farm. Lori dug potatoes out of the ground, picked tomatoes, collected ears of corn, gathered eggs from henhouses, and ran errands for the farmers. Often she was allowed to keep a few of the things that she helped harvest. The work used some of her boundless energy and made her less aggravating at home. The farm fresh foods she brought with her were always a blessing, and Lori was sweet about sharing her bounty. As Oma's little angel, I'd grown so used to being preternaturally good, I didn't quite know how to just be an ordinary kid. If I wasn't Oma's angel, I had no clear idea as to who or what I was. I'd never really been able to be myself. I used my first opportunity to get to know who I was by borrowing a farmer's enormous bicycle and learning to ride it. I couldn't reach the pedals while sitting on its seat, but managed to get myself down the street and around the corner with it before my first fall. Oma's heart might have stopped had she seen my initial efforts. As Oma was not around to see me and I had picked a street with hardly any traffic, I got back up and tried anew until I got the hang of it. Ah, the magic of sitting on that ample seat and being able to coast down the gentle incline with the wind pushing my pigtails back. Pedestrians beware. Girls, we're going to move to Canada to live with Father. Mother greeted us with this startling announcement after we had lived in the new place for 2 years. I was flabbergasted. A move to a foreign country on the other side of the planet? Or a real distance from where we were living? What? Really? When? And most importantly, for God's sake, why? We hadn't heard from Father in 6 years, not since he'd given us that nice tea set. No birthday or Christmas cards, no greetings of any kind. In fact, not a single word from him in all that time. We had no phone, even if he had wanted to call. Heck, as far as I knew, Father hadn't even paid a dime to support us. We were kept alive and housed all those years by welfare, Catholic charities, and those life-saving, wonderful care packages from the United States. Unbeknown to Lori and me, Mother had hounded the local government to go after Father for support. The German government in turn mobilized the Canadian government. Canada laid down an ultimatum to Father. You can either send support to your family, or you can bring your family over and support it here. Or you can get out of this country. Father had initially intended to bring his mistress, Ellie, to live with him in Canada. Ellie, the very woman he'd been living with at the time I was conceived on Mother's birthday. But Father's plans ran aground when Canada refused Ellie admission because she'd been diagnosed with tuberculosis. Realizing that he could soon be ousted and shipped back to Germany for failure to support us, Father sent for us instead. The Canadian government lent Father the funds to pay for our voyage. Father's hopes, dreams, or schemes were unknown to us at that time. But it caused some wonder in me years later as to what my life might have been like if Ellie had not had tuberculosis. As Father had rarely visited before he'd moved, I'd felt no connection to him, didn't miss him, and had no yearning for him. In fact, if anything, I resented him. While most of our schoolmates had fathers, we had but a plastic tea set without a pot, and a distant memory of a father we didn't know. I had no interest in moving. I don't need a father. I don't want a father. I don't even like Father. Don't make me go, please, I cried. I wanted nothing to do with Father. Please let me stay in Zulingen with Oma, I begged, as our date for departure loomed ever nearer. Being 9, no one consulted with me or cared whether I wanted to move or not. I tried to let myself grow used to the thought of the upcoming changes. With our departure date approaching, Mother set aside her knitting and started to learn English. With a small booklet in hand, she paced up and down the living room. She undertook her studies with fierce determination. Green grass. The grass is green. The moon is yellow. The cow jumps over the yellow moon. She read over and over. Laurie and I had no idea what Mother was saying, but admired her earnest resolve. Eventually, she'd get so good with her mastery of this new language that decades later, though having no formal education in English, Mother would beat college graduates at Scrabble who'd been English majors. Still, it didn't stop us from imitating her in pantomime when her back was turned, and then the two of us laughing to split our sides. Before we boarded the ocean liner named New York at Bremerhaven, Germany, in December 1956, we had to get our shots to inoculate us against foreign diseases, or perhaps to make sure we weren't carrying German viruses or bugs over to Canada. Probably both. Bent over the doctor's lap, embarrassed that my naked bottom was visible to a stranger, I thoroughly tensed my bum in anticipation of the needle. As a result, the cheek that got the needle was painful the entire journey to Prince Rupert every time I sat down. 2 more inoculations into our upper arms left tiny raised circles on our arms for decades. Oma remained behind in Solingen. Her 4 sons were still living, and at least 2 of them could be counted on to help. Hermann had been a soldier stationed in Poland at the time the Warsaw Ghetto was emptied. He would help Oma, and Richard was a journalist and a stand-up guy who would help Oma with what she might need or require. Jupp was an artist still living in France, and Harry was out of the question. Harry, a beloved Berlin gigolo in the 1930s, had been arrested and beaten to within an inch of his life for plotting to assassinate Hitler almost 2 decades earlier, but had survived, though no longer able to carry on his former occupation. Oma's zealous Catholic views caused her to avoid contact with such a blatant, sinful gigolo son. As I left Germany, I felt teary, standing at the big boat's railing, looking down at the throng on the dock as the band played Auf Wiedersehen, till we meet again. Perhaps I was just picking up and adopting the energy of the people crowded around me. It was the year of the Hungarian Revolution, and there were many sad Hungarians aboard with us. People on the dock and on the boat shouted and waved hats and kerchiefs as the large boat slowly drew away from the dock. My sadness evaporated within hours, replaced by the excitement of crossing the Atlantic Ocean by boat in December. My life's adventures had truly begun. End of chapter 2.